In today's video, I'll be replacing the rear axle beam, the rear brakes and the rear suspension on a Fiat Panda. When my friend asked me if I'd replace the rear axle beam on his Fiat Panda, I was like, yeah, no problem. But I wasn't expecting this. I mean, look at it, there's everything here. He has literally bought everything that's attached to the rear axle and hasn't skimped on components either. These are all pretty good brands, close to OEM quality or OEM quality in some cases. If you're watching this video, you may already know what can go wrong with these axle beams. You may need to do this on your car, but for those who don't know what the problem is, I will explain. Now, the problem with these axle beams is that they corrode right here where the spring seats. And this arrangement isn't unique to the Fiat Panda. This can also happen on the Fiat 500 and, you may be surprised to learn, also the Ford Ka. Not the original Ford Ka, the one that looked like it was wearing a nappy, but the second generation, as that shares its running gear with the Panda and the 500 too. The car is securely supported on axle stands, the vehicle's in gear and the front wheel is chocked. I have my favourite bedroom curtain here to protect me from the ground. That can be back on the curtain rail by tea time. And now we can see the extent of the scabbiness. I haven't actually been under this car for quite a long time, so I don't know how bad this has got. I'm simply replacing this because the owner would like me to, but we'll be able to see more when this is all off the car. I will be removing this entire axle beam from the car and swapping components over to the new one. It is, however, important to loosen certain things while the axle beam is still attached to the car for reasons of leverage. For this hub nut, for instance, under here is incredibly tight, and I need to loosen that while this is still fixed. We have replacements of these, so we don't have to be kind to the old ones. And this reveals a central hub nut. This is a 32mm nut. These are often very tight. The rear drums are actually quite hard to remove, so I'm going to take out this centre console, which is held in place by a few nuts, two at the front, one under here and one at the back. 10mm nuts. Once this console is out, I can loosen the handbrake adjustment, which should make it easier to remove the rear brake drums. There is a connector under here for the cigar lighter, and this reveals this nut here, which is responsible for adjusting the handbrake cables. So we loosen this nut here, which frees off the handbrake cables. We'll be changing these cables anyway, so we will be back in this area soon. So the brake drum's off and the hub nut is loosened slightly. The only thing we're going to be reusing from this whole area here is actually the stub axle, and with the hub nut removed we can withdraw the wheel bearing unit. And again the washer just inside there. There's a plastic under tray each side, which is held in place with some 10mm plastic nuts. I'm going to remove this because it will improve accessibility to the main mounting point for the rear axle. I'm also hoping that the connectors for the ABS sensors might be behind here. 3 mounting points on this left tray. And once that's out of the way, you get a really clear view of the actual axle mounting here, and also where this brake pipe joins the flexi hose. It does all look quite rusty actually. I hope that's all going to free off nicely. And remove the plastic under tray on the other side. It looks in a very similar state on this side, to be honest. It's all quite corroded. ABS wiring connector is right here. I'm just going to remove that. There's a little tab to push in, and this unclips from the body of the car. Now, whilst we have new flexi hoses, I'm slightly concerned that this may not release. Sometimes when you try and turn the union here, the nut, the pipe wants to go with it. If this happens, I think we'll be sticking with the existing flexi hoses, but I'm going to spray this with some WD and use a little wire brush on it to give it the best chance of coming undone. Now, despite trying to undo this, even with a quality brake pipe spanner, it really isn't moving. I'm not going to force the issue. So I'm now attaching some brake pipe clamps just so we clamp this off so we don't start losing brake fluid and draining down the entire system when I disconnect the brake pipes further down. I'll go and do the same on the other side. I will also disconnect the ABS connector this side as well. The ABS wiring is connected to this bracket, which will not come away with the axle beam, so it just needs to be pushed out. So with this loosened, these simply come out and slide out like that. And there are two little tabs that need to be pushed in, and then the handbrake cables will join the outside world. From the underside, it's easy to see with these handbrake cables how they're fitted. There's one point here, and another here. The rest are on the axle beam. This bracket's quite corroded, so I'm going to have to be a little bit careful that I don't break it in removing this. That cable is now off the car. And very similar here, we've got the handbrake cable there for the left hand side, that's where it goes through into the interior of the car, and we can follow that round. That unhooks from a guide again up here, and then it's a case of removing it from this bracket again with a degree of care because this bracket is quite corroded. That handbrake cable is now free as well, so that can just come away with the axle when we remove it. With this pipe clamped off and with this union here cleaned up with a wire brush, I'm now going to attempt to loosen this. Because we have a new metal brake pipe here, this can be sacrificial and it doesn't matter. That was not the case further forward at the other end. So far, all attempts to loosen this have resulted in this bracket bending, or this wanting to turn, this ferrule on the brake hose. So I'm going to hold that in place with a 17mm and try again. And that has freed off. It does feel as though it's damaging that pipe and twisting that pipe at the same time, but we don't care because we have a new one. This is twisting up just as I expected. It's twisting with this, with each turn. So as this pipe is going to be replaced anyway, I'm going to cut this with some side cutters, and now that's cut, you will see that that is so much easier to remove. On the near side, we have a similar thing. It's trying to turn the pipe, but not as bad as the other side, and I think we're going to be all right here. The ferrule on the brake hose has not started turning, and I haven't had to secure it with a 17mm. This side's definitely better. There we go. This nut and bolt is 19mm. This is held. I've already started loosening this. Due to the proximity of this thread to the body seal, you can't get a ring spanner on there. It has to be an open-ended, and by spraying some WD-40 on this thread, it allows this to come undone more easily. Right, just loosening this main rear axle beam mounting bolt here on the near side. This side is not such a devil as the other side. Again, you can't get a ring spanner on them, and it does take time. It really is like one turn at a time with this. It's quite time consuming. It's one of the most annoying parts of this job so far. So both nuts have been undone, where this bolt passes through the bush for the rear axle beam, both sides. So these bolts just need to be driven out, and then the upper shock absorber mounts need to be undone, and then the rear axle can be removed entirely as everything else has now been disconnected. The axle is being supported with a jack on this side, the near side. I'm now going to try and drive out that bolt. With the bolt removed from the near side, I'm slightly concerned on this side that there's not going to be enough clearance here between this and the fuel tank. Looking at this here, I just don't think that's going to be able to be removed. So might have to loosen the bracket that supports this. It's held in by 3 bolts up there. It's either that or move the fuel tank. Now this is a devil. That is almost out, but I don't think there's quite enough clearance. So I'm going to loosen this bracket with the 3 bolts. I'm just going to loosen the 3 bolts that secure the bracket that the axle beam bolts to. These I thought were 17, but they were quite corroded. Now I've rubbed all the rust off. It seems they're 15. All 3 of these bolts have actually come undone quite easily. And in removing them, I hope to create a greater clearance so we can get this bolt out that goes through the bush. With these 3 bolts removed from the bracket, there still seems to be some resistance here. It's supported by the jack. I'm now going to remove the top suspension mounting on this side to give this beam just a bit more movement. It's a top shock absorber bolt that we're going to undo. 15mm bolt. So this 15mm bolt for the shock is released. So with some leverage against this bracket, we can finally get that out. See, we couldn't lower this too much because this brake pipe is connected to it. We didn't want to put extra strain on that, so it was important not to lower it too much. I'm going to put one of those bolts in, or at least a couple, so that when this is fully lowered on the jack, that this does not come down and damage that brake pipe. So back around the other side, let's loosen this shock at the top. This, at this moment in time, is the only thing, the only bolt remaining that is holding this into the vehicle. It's quite well supported, so it shouldn't drop down. Very long bolts because they go right through the rear chassis rail. That is released and it did drop down a bit. So now we just need to lower this down gradually. Can now remove one of the coil springs and the bump stop. Another coil spring, another bump stop. That side is now free. We can move the jack and get rid of that. And the other side. The axle beam is clear of the car. To be honest, it's not as bad as I was expecting, and just to add a little disclaimer here, I'm replacing this at the request of the owner. This is not something I've diagnosed, but he did want it done, therefore I'm doing this for him. They can be a lot worse than this. They can be completely rotten and they can fail the MOT. This is scruffy as hell. I don't know how bad it would be if I started digging away at it, but we got a new one anyway. So here it is, the rear axle out of the vehicle. I would describe it as a controlled descent rather than it just dropping down when we remove the final bolts. It now is a case of removing the only salvageable parts from this that we need. So we've got the ABS sensor, which is there. We're going to want to save the stub axle and the brake back plate. So first of all, we'll remove these springs, pins and cups with this very useful tool. People have asked in previous videos what it is. So it's a snap-on BT17A. Worth its weight in gold, this thing. Same on this one as well. Now lever these brake shoes out. Remove the handbrake cable from the lever on the brake shoe. and we can just set that down, and we'll be rebuilding that up with the new set shortly. So the handbrake cable came out through this little piece. It looks like some sort of locking arrangement, very flimsy. I think we're going to have to try and reuse that. I don't think it comes with the cable, but we'll worry about that later. Just removing these wheel cylinder bolts. Can't get a socket on these because of where they're located. Going to cut this pipe because we have a replacement. Silly design of this really, but this will not loosen any further because it's fouling on this. So we need to lever the wheel cylinder out slightly. So this can be fully undone. The wheel cylinder is now off. So these rather corroded looking 17mm nuts need to be undone. They are not as tight as they look. All four of these fixings are out for this stub axle. The only thing left here is this ABS wheel speed sensor. I now need to remove the ABS sensor wiring from its securing points. And hopefully this will now come free with a light tap of the hammer. Okay, and after several very strong blows with the hammer, this came loose. It's important not to hit the back plate because you can distort it, but either in the center here or on the edges here, but it did come loose with force. Okay, so it's a good idea to salvage these little clips and bits to transfer to the new axle. To remove these little clips, it looks like there's a pin that goes through the middle, so we drive that out through the bottom like that. Maybe we need some help from a screwdriver. There we go. That's how you remove them. And the same again for the other side. And again, remove the handbrake cable from the lever arm on the shoe. Now this handbrake cable is completely seized in here. These clips, what an awful design these are, but this is stuck in here. That just broke clean off. You can see where the alloy has just gone crystallized and it's just broken. Need to get this out. I'm going to cut this cable because it's scrap anyway. And now I've got to set about freeing that off. So I'm going to have to abuse my tool here and give this a beating. That's a terrible euphemism, isn't it? I think that is free. I think we're definitely going to need some new ones of these. Stupid little clips. And that little devil is out. Hateful thing. So we're going to get this wheel cylinder off. We cut that again and work on these two 10mm bolts. Two wheel cylinder bolts are out. As is the wheel cylinder. Again, remove the ABS sensor wiring on this side. And now all we have to do is remove these four fixings. It's free. And that is how you strip down a rear axle on a Fiat Panda. There is nothing on here of any value to us. This is basically fit for the skip. So I'm going to clean up this surface here where this will be mating up against the new axle beam with a wire brush. Just make that good again. Just be careful of the speed sensor there. Clean up this area with some brake cleaner. These bolts mount this backplate to this stub axle. This one was rounded off and couldn't be removed. We were going to change these out for nice shiny new ones, but that one there is going to have to stay. It's in there solid, couldn't remove it. So new one in there on the left side and the same on the right side. Again, this one would not budge at all, and this one we're replacing. Applying some thread lock. So I'm just locking two nuts together. And then we can wind these studs in with some thread lock. Lock tight. Studs are now in both sides, both stub axles. These are ready to be refitted to the axle beam. Now just going to refit this, and this part of the stub axle is not pushing through, and I think it's the build-up of paint in here. I could just pull it in by doing up these bolts, but just to make sure that this is seated correctly, I'm just going to get a file and just lightly file off some of the paint around that edge there. Better, but not quite there. I need to take a little bit more off that. And just making sure this edge is as smooth as it can be as well. I have already done this with a wire brush, but it might just need a little bit more. And that seats perfectly this time. Around here it's all good. Let's get these 17mm lock nuts on. And these, according to my research, need to be torqued up to 65 Newton meters. If you're doing this job yourself, certainly do your own research. Make sure you agree with that figure. Don't just assume because I've done it at that's what you should do. The other side's been attached. It did need the same level of reworking to this hub area and just a little bit of grinding off of the paint on the inside of this piece here, and just refit the ABS wiring harness. So at this point we can start thinking about fitting these metal brake lines. It fits in this clip here. I think these are probably going to need a little bit of manipulation. I don't think they are perfect in terms of the angles, but we'll make them fit. As I've said before in videos, it's always easier to tighten the union into a wheel cylinder before you actually mount the wheel cylinder solidly. You just stand a better chance of getting the angle right. That is hand tight, and now I can fix the wheel cylinder with the bolts. I've just tightened these little 10mm wheel cylinder securing bolts. We don't need to go mad with them, they are very small. We weren't able to replace these unfortunately, so we had to reuse them. This is done up hand tight. I'll tighten that fully at a later date once we've got everything back in on the car. And just moving around to the other side here, I like to keep an elastic band around the wheel cylinder until it's all set up, until at least until we fit the shoes, because that prevents the pistons from popping out or overextending. Secure these in this clip. So this is the other wheel cylinder for the other side. Didn't have an elastic band in the box with that one for some reason, so I've just put a little bit of masking tape around it, just keep those pistons in. And again, it's just a case of fitting this pipe here. There we go, that got started nice and easily. and just the 2 bolts here for the wheel cylinder. And just snip these up. Again, as I said earlier, we don't need to go crazy on these. They are small and the bolts are old. Refit that in the little clip. As I said earlier, there may be some adjustments required here. We'll worry about that when we get back to the car. So it's been a very busy day, absolutely filthy, but got quite a lot done. Refitted the back plates and the stub axles, wheel cylinders and the metal brake pipes here. ABS sensor wiring has been repositioned. I think we're going to call it a day now, as it's just starting to get dark. And after a much earned beer or two and a good night's sleep, we'll carry on with this in the morning.